tata garu ma nanani ma family ni US ki పంపించారు కొన్ని బాధలు వస్తాయని ఆ రీజన్లో ఆయన ఎప్పుడు చదవలేదు కానీ 3 భాషలు నేర్చుకున్నాడు మా తాత కానీ అప్పుడు చిన్నప్పటి నుంచే నా కల్చర్ నుంచి దూరం అయ్యాను అప్పుడప్పుడు ఇష్టం కోసము వచ్చేదాన్ని ఇక్కడికి కానీ కొంచెం ఇంగ్లీష్లో కూడా మాట్లాడతాను What I've noticed in the US newspapers is about the Telangana movement. There have been a few articles, కొన్ని articles వచ్చాయి, but these articles are primarily focused on hunger strikes, like Chandrasekhar Rao's hunger strike, and also the self-immolation by students, the protests, the burnings, suicides. So from this, there's nothing about Telangana women, there's nothing about, too much about the water or livelihoods, there's nothing very much about the history, the context of putting this struggle as something related to development, modernity, globalization, capitalism, Ivani Gurinchi. There's no connections being made, or how this movement may be connected to other movements also in other parts of the world where there are places that are left behind. Throughout the world, there are places. Whenever there's development in some places, other places are left behind and forgotten. And akkada struggles untai. So one thing is to connect to other struggles as well, because there may be connections with what we are doing here and other places. And then the other thing that I'm noticing is that the things that are noticed, the hunger strikes and self-immolation, these are in some senses interesting to the West, or to anybody, to the human imagination, because they are, in a sense, performances or spectacles. Oka spectacle laga untundi. So, in a sense, I'm a geographer. I've been a geography professor, social sciences, resources, Gurinchi. But since then, for the last 5 years, I've been writing stories and reading stories from around the world, Telugu stories and German stories and all over the world. Naku Gurinchi chala okalanti passion vastundi. Mana stories lopata there's wisdom, there's possibility, mana human suffering kanputundi, and mana connections ikkada nunchi akkada humanity lo vere untayi ee struggles kani konni commonalities kuda kanipistayi mana stories lo. And this week I've been reading some Telugu stories, but I've also been reading Kafka, a German writer in the early 1900s, and he wrote something called a couple of stories that are wonderful. One was called The Hunger Artist, and it was in the context of a kind of circus. Oka artist undedi, and he would fast. Performance kosam, and that was his livelihood. But with modernity, adi fashion poindi. So being hungry, being an artist, there's some kind of story he's saying about how modernity is erasing this. But it occurs to me that in some sense these protests seem like a performance, a spectacle, much like this hunger artist of Kafka's. And the second story is Metamorphosis. And in this story, a young clerk, one day he wakes up and he turns into a bug. Purugu aipotaru. And then his family doesn't know what to do, and gradually he feels like he's a burden on the family, and he decides to die. He commits suicide. And then his family gradually becomes lifted up. They feel released from the burden, and they progress. They get their jobs, and so there's a metaphor here as well of sacrifice for the greater community. And what I think about in terms of these protests, what occurs to me in Telangana, the hunger strikes and the self-immolation, is that first of all, the days of sati are over. We're not planning to do that, and there's a certain kind of masculinity in these kinds of spectacles. So what I'm interested in is not sort of spectacles of death, but perhaps spectacles of life, something that women can creatively create in order to, because there's something about symbolic protest. We have to work at all levels: the legal level, community level, levels of government, levels of NGOs, levels of the committees for preservation of the buildings, all levels. But there's also something very important in terms of capturing the imagination of people and in symbolic protest. Because in this day and age, we're not going to take up arms. We're not going to fight with guns. We're going to fight with our imagination and our images and our stories, right? So in that sense, what I'd like for us to talk about or think about in the discussion time is ways in which we can create women's symbolic protests, in ways you're already doing it, perhaps. Wimla was telling me how she wanted to put a lotus flower in all the tanks in the region. Well, why not do it collectively as a protest, so that we're reclaiming the tanks? We're going to rescue the tanks. Something like this, something organized, something deliberate, something that will be covered by the media. Maybe the newspapers are never going to be interested in tanks or flowers, I don't know. But collectively, we can create that interest or generate it from the ground up. And then the world decides what they want to cover.